Rome believed itself invincible. Its legions marched across scorching deserts, pushed through dense forests, and climbed frozen mountains with one unshakable certainty: they would win. For Romans, defeat was an aberration, something that happened to barbarians, to the weak, to those who ignored Mars, god of war. But that arrogance had a price. In this video, you'll meet the 10 enemy commanders who humiliated Rome, men who defied the greatest power of the ancient world and proved that even history's most feared empire could bleed. Long before Rome ruled the world, it nearly vanished. In 390 BC, when it was still an expanding republic, the city faced a brutal enemy from the north, the Senoan Gauls, led by a warrior chieftain named Brennus. These Gauls weren't a formal army, but a migrating warband, armed to the teeth and hungry for land and plunder. Rome, overconfident in its recent rise, sent troops to meet them on the banks of the river Allia. It was a fatal mistake. The Roman army was slaughtered. Survivors fled in chaos, and nothing stopped the Gauls from marching straight to the city's gates. Rome lay defenseless. The Senate took refuge on the Capitoline Hill, while the population sought safety outside the walls. Brennus entered a practically empty city and began the sack. But the most humiliating moment was still to come. To salvage what remained, the Romans offered gold in exchange for withdrawal. During the weighing, they realized the Gauls were using a rigged scale. When they complained, Brennus tossed his sword onto the balance and declared, "Vae victis, woe to the vanquished." The message was clear: the defeated have no right to justice. Brennus's sack left the first gaping wound in Roman pride. The city was devastated, its people traumatized, and the memory haunted generations. Fear of the Gauls hardened into hatred, and that hatred would fuel future wars. Pyrrhus was not just a general, he was a king, a strategist, and a distant relative of Alexander the Great, with an ambition to match his lineage. When the Greek cities of southern Italy sought help against Rome's expansion, he saw a chance to build his own Western Empire. What followed was a military and cultural clash without precedent. In 280 BC, Pyrrhus crossed the Ionian Sea with a professional army. Macedonian phalanxes, heavy cavalry, archers, and something the Romans had never faced: war elephants. At Heraclea, Romans accustomed to close, terrain-driven fighting were stunned by a machine of war arranged in tight lines and guarded by living walls of ivory and iron. Pyrrhus won, but at a steep cost. The next year at Asculum, the outcome repeated: another Greek victory and more blood spilled. Losses were so heavy that Pyrrhus himself is said to have remarked, "Another victory like this, and I am undone." From that campaign, we get the term Pyrrhic victory. What most humiliated Rome wasn't only the result on the field, it was facing for the first time an enemy who beat them with discipline and superior tactics. Rome, which had mainly triumphed over disorganized or tribal foes, found in Pyrrhus a mirror of what it was not yet: a refined military power. Those defeats forced Rome to evolve. They learned, reformed their legions, and in time surpassed the phalanxes that had made them fall. But before that, a new nightmare arose. A commander who wouldn't just win, but nearly break Rome's spirit. If Brennus wounded Rome and Pyrrhus forced it to rethink, Hannibal almost erased it from the map. Son of the Carthaginian general Hamilcar Barca, Hannibal grew up under a vow: to destroy Rome. When the Second Punic War broke out, he didn't just honor his father's promise, he rewrote the rules of war. In 218 BC, he did the unthinkable. Instead of attacking by sea, he crossed the Alps with tens of thousands of soldiers, heavy cavalry, and about 40 war elephants. The crossing alone was epic: snowstorms, avalanches, hostile tribes. Yet he descended into Italy ready to fight. What came next was a sequence of defeats that traumatized Rome. At the Trebia, Hannibal ambushed the Romans in biting cold. At Lake Trasimene, he shattered them using the fog as an ally. And in 216 BC at Cannae, he reached the peak of his genius. With a smaller army, he encircled and crushed 8 Roman legions. More than 50,000 men may have died in a single day, one of the greatest slaughters in military history. Rome went into psychological collapse. Allied cities defected. The Senate panicked. For 15 years, Hannibal roamed Italy like an unstoppable shadow. He was never defeated on Italian soil. Though recalled to face Scipio Africanus and ultimately beaten near Carthage, he left behind an open wound. His very name became legend. Roman parents calmed disobedient children with the warning, Hannibal ad portas. Hannibal is at the gates. No other enemy inspired such terror in the Roman imagination. As Rome consolidated control of the Mediterranean, it assumed the Iberian Peninsula would be just another province to tame. Instead, it met an enemy like few before, Viriathus. He wasn't a king or a trained general. He was a Lusitanian shepherd who became one of Iberia's greatest resistance leaders. Raised to command out of necessity, Viriathus knew every stone, pass, and valley of his homeland. His army was small and poorly equipped, but lethal. He used the land as a weapon, ambushed Roman columns, vanished into the mountains, and returned days later with lightning strikes. It was guerrilla warfare in its purest form, and Rome, used to open field battle, simply didn't know how to reply. One by one, Roman generals sent to crush him were defeated, some killed, others humiliated. Viriathus's prestige grew so much that, in a rare move, the Roman Senate proposed peace treaties, a humiliating concession from an empire that seldom recognized legitimacy in its foes. But Rome never tolerated defeat for long. Unable to beat him in battle, it turned to treachery. They bribed 3 of his close lieutenants, who murdered him in his sleep. When the traitors came for their reward, they heard only, "Rome does not pay traitors." Viriathus didn't just defy Rome, he proved that courage, cunning, and knowledge of the land could outweigh legions. His example became legend among Iberian peoples. Rome was the Mediterranean's dominant power when Julius Caesar arrived in Egypt. After defeating Pompey in the Civil War, Caesar intervened in the Ptolemaic succession, supporting Cleopatra against her brother Ptolemy XIII. In doing so, he underestimated Egyptian pride and resistance. While Caesar entangled himself in palace intrigues, Cleopatra's younger sister Arsinoe IV escaped Roman custody and allied with the general Achilles, leader of the Egyptian forces. Together, they seized control of the local army and launched a relentless siege against Caesar and his men, who were isolated inside the royal palace at Alexandria. For weeks, Caesar, the very symbol of Roman invincibility, was besieged. Supplies were cut off, parts of his fleet burned, and his soldiers were attacked constantly in the city streets and alleys. He had to order improvised fortifications just to hold out. The ancient elite watched in disbelief as a Roman general was pinned down by an Eastern Kingdom's troops. The humiliation was obvious. Rome, which dictated terms to kings, now begged for reinforcements outside Egypt. Only with the arrival of Mithridates of Pontus and his forces, weeks later, did Caesar regain control. He emerged victorious, but the stain remained. The episode proved that even Caesar wasn't untouchable. For Egyptians, however brief the moment, it was indescribable glory, a millennial kingdom making a Roman bleed in his host's own house. Arminius was the type of enemy Rome feared most, one trained by Rome itself. Born among the Cherusci, a Germanic tribe beyond the Rhine, he was sent to Rome as a youth in a political arrangement. There he received military education, Roman citizenship, and rose to the rank of auxiliary officer. To Roman eyes, he was the model of successful integration. Inside, he never forgot who he was or what Rome had done to his people. In AD 9, serving as advisor to the governor of Germania, Publius Quinctilius Varus, Arminius set his trap. He convinced Varus there was a rebellion and urged him to march 3 legions, about 20,000 men, deep into the Teutoburg forest, hostile, boggy, narrow terrain. The Roman columns stretched for kilometers, pinned between dense trees and marshes, the perfect stage for disaster. For 3 straight days, Germanic forces ambushed the legions. With no room to maneuver, no visibility, and the weather against them, the Romans were butchered. When it ended, almost nothing remained. The eagles, the sacred standards, were captured, and Varus took his own life on the field. The shock was so profound that, on hearing of the defeat, Emperor Augustus reportedly cried out, "Varus, give me back my legions." Rome lost more than men. It lost confidence in its own expansion. From that day on, plans to conquer Germania were abandoned. The Rhine frontier became permanent. Arminius was no mere barbarian. He was the architect of Rome's worst defeat to that time, a scar even centuries couldn't erase. In the 3rd century, Rome entered one of its most fragile phases: internal rebellions, economic crises, civil wars, and constant frontier invasions. Amid the chaos, a new power rose in the east, the Sasanian Empire. At its center stood Shapur I, an ambitious Persian king determined to expand over Mesopotamia and beyond. While Rome struggled to hold its borders, Shapur launched coordinated offensives against the eastern provinces. He didn't just test the frontier, he aimed to seize it. In AD 260, the elderly Emperor Valerian decided to lead a campaign personally. With an army weakened by plague and poorly prepared, he was defeated at the Battle of Edessa. What followed was unprecedented in Roman history. Shapur captured Valerian alive. A Roman emperor, a thing once unthinkable, became a prisoner. Shapur didn't settle for a military victory. He turned Valerian into a living symbol of humiliation. Accounts say the emperor was forced to kneel as a human step for the king to mount his horse. After his death, his skin was allegedly flayed, stuffed, and displayed in a Persian temple as a war trophy. For Rome, it wasn't just a defeat, it was an affront to imperial dignity. Never, before or after, was a Roman emperor captured in battle. The news shattered morale among troops, citizens, and provinces. For centuries, Rome was more than a capital. It was a symbol, the eternal city, home of the gods, seat of an empire that believed itself unassailable. But in the early 5th century, that myth began to crumble. The Western Empire reeled from political instability, betrayals, and constant external threats. Into this decay stepped Alaric, king of the Visigoths, an old ally Rome chose to scorn. Alaric knew the empire well. He had served as an auxiliary commander and negotiated treaties Rome then refused to honor. Tired of broken promises, he marched against the source of his frustration, Rome itself. In AD 410, after a tense siege, a weakened, divided, poorly defended city opened its gates. For the first time in almost 800 years, a foreign enemy entered the Roman capital. For 3 days, the Visigoths plundered temples, homes, and palaces. Churches were largely respected, but the rest was given over to pillage. It wasn't total destruction, but the damage was irreparable, psychologically, symbolically, historically. Jerome, one of the era's great intellectuals, wrote in shock, "The world is in ruins." Alaric didn't destroy Rome with fire and blood. He destroyed the idea of Rome as the untouchable center of the world. He proved the empire's heart could be pierced and the gods no longer protected the city. If Alaric cracked Rome's myth, Genseric sealed its fate. 45 years after the first sack, the city still breathed, but was only a shadow of itself. The Western Empire tottered, eaten by internal strife, succession crises, and a ruined state apparatus. Then the final blow came by sea. Genseric, king of the Vandals, had built a naval empire in North Africa. He ruled Carthage and controlled vital trade routes. When he learned of Emperor Valentinian III's murder, a ruler who had promised his daughter to Genseric's son, the Vandal king found the perfect pretext. He assembled his fleet and sailed for Rome. The city, once again, was defenseless. The new emperor, Petronius Maximus, fled and was killed by his own subjects. When Genseric arrived, he met no resistance, but unlike Alaric, who plundered for 3 days and left, Genseric stayed for 2 weeks. The sack was meticulous, methodical, total. Religious relics, artworks, precious metals, statues, everything in Rome that still had value was carried off. This wasn't chaotic looting, it was calculated dismantling. The impact was so deep that centuries later the word vandalism was coined in reference to it. Not for what he burned, but for what he emptied. Genseric didn't set Rome ablaze. He left it without a soul, without glory, without strategic value, an imperial shell. With that blow, the West was no longer Rome, only ruin waiting for the end. Rome saw itself as eternal, more than an empire, an idea, a promise of order, civilization, absolute dominion. But that illusion shattered, piece by piece, with each defeat you've heard about here. These commanders, so different from one another, showed in different moments that Rome was not invincible. All left deep scars on the empire's memory. Scars no monument, triumphal march, or statue could erase. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe to keep exploring the great stories of the past. And leave a comment. Which of these generals do you think humiliated Rome the most? And may Mars guide you in battle,